Hello, U.S. history. So, what we're talking about today is what happened after the Civil War. Is how do we put this country back together after we broke it apart and killed 300,000 Americans and burned American cities? And at the same time, address what the biggest problem we had to come into the Civil War. Well, actually, the problem coming in the Civil War, slavery. So this is to tell you a little bit. It's called Reconstruction. You're reconstructing the United States after you broke it. So, so the key questions here is how do you bring the South back into the Union? How do you take people that basically left and now would be technically traitors? How do you bring them back into a union that they didn't want to be part of? Next is how do you rebuild the South after all of its destruction during the war? How do you fix these things that got broke? And then how do you integrate the newly emancipated, black freedmen? How do you take these people that were slaves and then make them part of the American system? And then what branch of the government would be the best way to do this? Like today we have things like FEMA and we have the federal, bureaucracy to do this. Well, in those days they didn't have any of this. So how do you help African Americans who are enslaved and don't have any money or a roof over their head or you know and how do you rebuild cities? How do you, bring back former, Confederate soldiers back how do you take people that were in the military that switched and fought for the Confederacy? How do you bring them back into the military? So, well, Lincoln came up with a plan. And this basically, Lincoln's plan was that, and Lincoln, what Lincoln wants to do is he gives a famous speech after he's re-elected called his Malice Towards None speech. That basically what Lincoln wants to do is forgive and forget. We're just going to move on to a degree. So, what he wants is that he's going to allow amnesty to those states. All right. That basically, if 10% of the population in 1860 takes an oath of office, or sorry, an oath of loyalty, sorry, there we go, an oath of loyalty that they could then reestablish the government and then they'd be recognized as part of the United States. So 10% of the population, the voting population in 1860, if 10% of them take an oath that they will never rebel against the United States again, that's all it took to come back into the Union. So that was his plan. And it would pardon all of the Confederate leaders, would just forgive and forget, and you could all come back. So we're got these Lincoln governments going to form in some states. These are these loyal assemblies, and they're basically the idea is that they want to bring the Union back as quickly as possible. Well, the Republicans don't really like that idea. And what we have a group called the Radical Republicans who want to punish the South for what they did and at the same time help African Americans who are now free. So what they're going to do is they're going to require 50%. This is called the Wade Davis bill. So Lincoln's only 10% have to come in. And it's just kind of loose. Yeah, I don't really, okay, I'm not going to rebel. Maybe. Okay. This is an ironclad oath that they swear that they will never lead a rebellion ever again, but it has to be 50% of that state's population. And of course, if you do this, you're like, well, what's the big deal? Well, if you break it, you can go automatically to prison. Everything's off. All bets are off, and you go to prison. They're required the state constitution conventions then would have been formed to basically they're going to change each state convention or constitution so that it mirrors the federal constitutions and they would put in specific safeguards because Lincoln really doesn't have any safeguards. Like basically, he doesn't make them promise anything when it comes to African American rights. And the radical Republicans they want set safeguards. They want to know that slavery is over, that the rights of African Americans are going to be protected in the southern states. So what happens? Well, it gets pushed through and Lincoln then does this weird thing that only in America you could do. It's called a pocket veto. So basically, what he does is he takes the bill, he puts it in his pocket, And if the time runs out to sign it, so he can't say, well, I didn't, I vetoed it. There's no signature. He just basically lets the time run out. And once the time runs out, the bill dies. It doesn't become a law. He killed it by basically doing nothing with it, hiding it. So, but out of this, Lincoln is going to push for one thing in particular. He's going to push through. And if you've seen the video in government class of the movie Lincoln, he's going to push through what we call the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment in slavery in the United States, that basically you cannot own a person and therefore is not a practice. Now, here's the thing is that even though it's in the Constitution, there's no law. The Constitution is a governing concept. The law is where they have to come back and they make punishments for what we call human trafficking. It's not actually called slavery, but that's what it is. Human trafficking is punishable by law, but you cannot have government sanctioned slavery anymore because it is a violation of the 13th Amendment. And they push this through. All right. Lincoln did have a plan, though. Lincoln to help African Americans. Lincoln's plan was to create this thing called the Freedmen's Bureau. And what they would do is they would set up organizations in the South to help African Americans. One of the famous things was the promise of 40 acres and a mule, that you would take land that was seized by the government. You would then divide it up, give African Americans a set amount of land and the tools, and not just animals, but also the tools then to help them get started as farmers. Well, the people that were sent down to administer this, some were really good people, but they were seen as bad people in the South. The South saw these as like an invading army of bureaucrats. And so these carpetbaggers, as they're called, were white Southern Democrats that came down there and were capitalizing. Some of them actually got rich by capitalizing on by putting in these things. And scalawags were people that were Southerners that were helping them. But these carpetbaggers, because the bag they carried their stuff down there to run these freedmen bureaus, they became a symbol of corruption and of this invading army of Northerners coming to tell Southerners what to do. And this fed to a degree what they call the lost cause, is that after the Civil War, Southerners then reimagined the Civil War to a degree that in actuality they saw it as what was an argument over slave property, and that became more and more interpreted as a part of states' rights, and therefore and also became this idea that the South identity wasn't really lost, that what people thought was going to go away was this idea of the South and its identifying itself as this independent state. It didn't happen that way, because the invading army of bureaucrats and the occupation by the northern armies actually fed the idea that, well, the war wasn't really over, that it was just going to keep going on. And it, to a degree, it still kind of manifests itself in some of these ideas. This idea that the federal government can't come and tell me what to do is kind of fed by this after the Civil War. So did they actually get their 40 acres? Nope. Did they get their mules? Nope. There wasn't any money set up for these things. The people that were sent down there had no real power to set these things up. And the land, even though it was abandoned, in many cases was either taken or redivided by the government when they got down there, and usually went back to white owners. So, in many of these times, the plantation owners that had the land now just shift over to landowners and rent it to poor African Americans and poor whites, and create this lovely thing called sharecropping, which was basically economic slavery, and it enslaved not just African Americans, like I said, but poor whites as well, who then had to work and sell their crop to pay the landlord, and in many cases couldn't pay the landlord. So they never got their mule, they never got their acres. And if anything, it created something even worse. Now, well, nothing's worse than slavery, but it created something bad in the form of what we call sharecropping. So, oops. But it did do one thing. It did create schools. And that was a very important thing, that a lot of white college and a lot of African American educated individuals, mainly women, went south and started opening schools, which then taught not only African Americans, but also poor whites, who then gave them the ability to read and write, which then made it harder for people to rip them off. So, yeah, you didn't get your mule, but you did get an education, which was kind of a help. So, um, well, Lincoln, of course, we know what happened to Lincoln. Lincoln never really got to go much further on Reconstruction because Booth ended that problem for him and that he killed Lincoln. And now Lincoln's buried in Springfield. And so Johnson comes in and he is not very friendly to the radical Republicans or to African Americans. He kind of goes along with Lincoln's plan because it's not that he really wants to fix things. He just kind of wants to get it over with and not really do anything for African Americans or for fixing the system. Um, there's he's not going to do much, to help with the repudiation of slavery, state debts, or anything like that. So yeah, it didn't go over well. So, and there's a big fear that Johnson, of course, is going to be kind of a pro slave owner, and he kind of wants to remove control by the northern states of the southern states. And so, even though there are laws that are going to be in place to help African Americans, that since he doesn't really care about helping the freed African Americans, that might cause a little problem in the fact that the South is going to take away those rights that have been quickly granted. And what you're going to see is the beginning of what we call black codes. It was basically that it kept African Americans in place, in check. So it forced them, like we said before, into what we call sharecropping. And then that sharecropping was something it also picked up poor whites too, that basically you rent the land, you pay for the land with your crops, and if you have a bad year, you owe this year's rent and next year's rent. And so you could never get out of poverty, and you're constantly tied to the land because of economics. Where before you were tied because you're a slave, now you're tied because you owe the guy that you rented the land from, and they're still getting rich. The upper class were getting rich, and the lower class of poor African Americans and poor whites were being kept down. But the black codes kept them. They couldn't get into town at certain times. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold public office. They couldn't go into certain stores. I mean, the black codes really restricted their economic and their social mobility, as well as their economic mobility, and that they basically trapped them in this sharecropping idea. Um, this is when you're going to see the big break. Is that if Johnson's going along with Lincoln's idea, but Lincoln was doing it just because he wanted to heal the nation and figured down the road I can fix these problems. Johnson just doesn't care, right? He just doesn't care. He just wants the country back together and to move on. And so you're going to see a push to by Congress and the radical Republicans to control Johnson, and they're going to start passing bills. And Johnson just keeps turning around vetoing. Like he vetoed the Freeman Bill, he vetoed the Civil Rights Act in 1866. He vetoes and then they override him. So he vetoes them, and they turn around and they override him. Like every veto he does, they just turn around and they override him. And this is the radical Republicans kick in. And here's the big thing: the 14th Amendment. This is very important. 14th Amendment, because African Americans, you could argue, because the way the Constitution is written, that African Americans weren't citizens. So therefore, they don't have the rights of an American citizen. So what they did to move them towards voting and ownership and property was that you had to make them citizens. So the 14th Amendment says that anyone born in the United States has the rights and responsibilities of an American citizen. So if you're born here, you're an American citizen, and it says natural born. Well, the Supreme Court has then gone on to basically interpret that if your parents are an American citizen, so one parent's an American citizen and the other one's not an American citizen, you're an American citizen. If you're born in Panama and one parent is an American citizen, you're an American citizen. If you're born on a ship in the ocean, if the ship is registered to the United States, you are an American citizen and therefore have all the rights and responsibilities of an American citizen. So so that's that 14th Amendment. They're going to push through the 13th, 14th Amendment of ratification, and they're going to require these into state constitutions to come back in. Congress is going to basically work to, they're going to send the military down. And this is one of the things the radicals are going to do is they're going to station the military down in the southern states as an occupying force to make sure that that voting rights are done and that citizenship is respected and that African Americans are protected, which is going to lead to things like the Ku Klux Klan forming, because the military in the southern states then gets seen as this invading occupied force, which creates even more animosity between Southerners and Northerners. And at the same time, though, it did ensure that African Americans got the right to vote and that they got the right to hold office. So, yeah, so that they're going to divide up the districts. That's why a lot of the military bases, if you ever wondered why all these military bases are in southern states, they were occupation bases. That they basically were keeping the military down there to protect the rights of citizens who are African Americans from things like the Ku Klux Klan or from black codes. They were making sure that they could register to vote and that they could actually hold office, and they were protecting them. That was the reason. So you put the military down there, and that's like we said. That's why you see so many U.S. military bases are in southern states, because that was part of the occupying force. And remember, there's a big fear about Southerners still. The NRA basically started in the 1860, late 60s, early 70s, if I remember right. I think it was early 70s, was the idea of training Northerners to prepare for a possibility of another civil war. So you put the Command Army Act. The president must issue all Reconstruction orders through the commander of the military, or he has to go. And this, the big one, the Tenure of Office Act. Johnson's vetoing all these bills. Every bill that comes through, he's vetoing. And so they need to get Johnson out of the way. So they passed this thing called the Tenure of Office Act because they know there are radical Republicans in Johnson's presidency, in his cabinet, and they are rubbing him wrong. And basically, it ensures that if you're a member of the cabinet, that once you've held the position for a period, that you cannot be removed by the president, which is kind of a crock since you work for the president and he should be able to fire you. Well, Johnson then gets himself in a little trouble, is that he basically gets into dispute with this guy right here. Move this over with Stanton, who was a member of the cabinet. Johnson then fires Stanton, which legally he should have the ability to do. This is unconstitutional. This law is, but he vetoed it. They pass it, override his veto. Stanton rubs Johnson wrong. Johnson fires him. Johnson broke the law. Johnson gets impeached. He's only one of 3 presidents in American history that have impeached because he broke the law. Even though they broke the law to basically impeach him, it didn't matter. Okay, so he's impeached. He's charged by 126 to 47. He was able to save his position by 1 vote. So, but he basically is ineffective president. Johnson, they're just overriding everything he does. There was a good part that there's a lot of education of African Americans again in the South, a lot of voting, a lot of registering and voting in southern states in 1867, and that's we're going to see the beginning of what we call the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed federal voting rights for African Americans. So basically gives African Americans the right to vote. Women, you're not going to get the right to vote. You got to add 4 more numbers to this. 19th is when you're going to get the right to vote. So the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, basically says that the right of U.S. citizens cannot be abridged on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Since it's phrased this way, they can't just add women. So that's why they had to pass the 19th Amendment. So this gives African Americans the right to vote. Okay, Congress has the power to enforce this article, which gives them the right to support and go in what we're going to see later in the Voting Rights Acts in the 1960s. The Enforcement Act is to stop these groups like the Ku Klux Klan. They're coming in, and the Klan was a major problem. They saw themselves as the avenging angels and the protector of white power in the South and white tradition. They would go in and burn schools and harass African Americans, and that was part of the reason why the military was down there, was to stop these things from happening. And what we said, the idea of the lost cause is this idea that that basically what happened is that the South retold the history in a way that changed the narrative, that they pushed away from slavery as the cause, that it was the, and like if we were taking this class in the southern states, they would call this the war of northern aggression. And it repaints it more as a states' rights issues, ignoring the idea that the reason why it was a states' rights issue was because it was a property issue over slaves. And so it also creates this kind of it, this antebellum idea of this genteel farmers and all this, and that the Northerners were the aggressors that came down and destroyed this way of life. And that was very much stressed in films and stuff in the 1950s, 1960s, things like, or 1930s and 40s too, like Gone with the Wind or Song of the South from Disney, that paints this kind of different, they flip the image, so to speak. So, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1875 basically deny full equal use of public conveniences. Now, the problem is that all these things are being passed, but without the military down there to enforce these things, then the South then basically goes back and undoes the civil rights laws, which was the reason why you have the civil rights movement in the 1950s. So there's your presidential election in 1868. And the problem is that Grant is just full of scandals. Grant comes in, Grant's presidency is, the term lobbyist comes from the Grant presidency because he goes and sits in the lobby and people come and basically swindle him for privilege and stuff. He had people are selling federal lands, they're scamming money off of people. It was a really corrupt presidency. It wasn't that Grant was the one, it was, they're just, yeah, it was bad. And it's the election in 1876, comes down to Hayes and Tilden. And here's what happens: that Hayes and Tilden, and here's how the story ends. The radical Republicans they thought they were doing the right thing, that they were pushing these things and pushing, and they did. They ended slavery. They gave us the 14th Amendment that now is the thing that's used even for women, for equal pay and everything like that, and that it determined that people are American citizens. The Freedmen's Bureau that came from Lincoln created educational systems that set the stage for Howard University and places like that. You saw the first African American congressmen, the first African American senators. You see the first African American governor in the South. And it did great things, and it gave people the right to vote based on your race, or that you could vote no matter your race or color. So those were great things the radical Republicans did. However, the impeachment of Johnson, the military being stationed down there, people got tired of paying for the military to be down there. They thought that the impeachment of the president, they didn't like Johnson, but they're like, did we really have to impeach him? And then on top of it, it's just the grind that the Civil War had been over since 1865. And here we are in 1877, and people are just tired. They're tired of the war. And so in the election, they split the vote. Hayes and Tilden split the vote. And Hayes goes, all right, he goes to the Southern congressman and says, look, if you get me into being president, because it got pushed into the House of Representatives, if you push this towards me and make me president, I'll pull the military out of the South. And that's what they did. Hayes becomes president, and they pull the military out. Well, without the military down there, it allowed groups like the Klan to become more powerful. It allowed the South to roll out all the black codes that restricted African American rights. And so, even though you had the 15th Amendment that said African Americans could vote, but then they put grandfather clauses, say that if your grandfather was a slave, then you can't vote. They put in reading codes that says, well, if you can't read, you can't vote. They put in a poll tax. It means you have to pay $5 to vote, and $5 to some families was an entire, it could be an entire month's pay, and you can't vote. And it hit not only African Americans, but it also hit poor whites. But all the things that was done in Reconstruction to help African Americans are undone, basically because Northerners lost interest, that they were tired and wanted to go home. They that's what they did. They just dropped it and went home. And so all the things that were done were undone to a degree, that left African Americans without the rights that they were promised. It allowed for an economic burden in the form of sharecropping. So even though cotton was gone, which was a good thing because now the South could start industrializing, but they still had sharecropping, which kept an economic burden on people. They took away people's rights, and which is going to set you up for the 1950s with the civil rights movement. And on top of it, they reinterpret the Civil War, and they change it from a slavery issue to more of a states' rights issue, which the states' rights issue was based on the idea that the government's trying to tell you what to do with slavery. So it it all kind of came apart. And now, you know, we'll have to figure it out later. So yeah, so that's it. That's Reconstruction. And so there are some benefits though, because it's going to create westward movement, and the South no longer is an agrarian cotton grower, and African Americans are a step closer to freedom because by the 1950s we're going to see the civil rights movement. It's just going to take a few more numbers on this one here, and it does create this idea of federalism, that the federal government can tell you what to do because they just basically whooped the Southerners and did what they did. So okay, well, that's it.